the ICC, in issuing an arrest warrant for Putin, is playing a long game. It is trying to lay down a marker that responsibility for this conflict and for these crimes goes all the way to the top. And that's really important. But it's obviously going to take the right array of circumstances for Putin himself to find to be prosecuted in The Hague. It's going to take a radical change of policy or government in Russia, or it's going to take him traveling to a place that is a country that's willing to arrest him.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And today we are joined by the director of the Human Rights Initiative at the American think tank, the CSIS. Marti Flacks has spent more than a decade in the US government and most recently served at the National Security Council. Marti Flacks, welcome to Frontline. Thank you so much for your time today. This time we're focusing on international law and how some of the dreadful atrocities committed in the war in Ukraine and those who perpetrated them might have their day in court. Can we start, though, by the case that's taking place in The Hague at the International Court of Justice? Ukraine is effectively challenging the premise on which Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. Can you just explain that to us?
That's right. So you'll recall that when Russia launched its invasion, they were making the case that genocide was taking place inside Ukraine and that justified their military operations. Ukraine's calling them out on this premise. They have taken a case to the International Court of Justice in The Hague, arguing two things, really. One, that there was no genocide taking place in Ukraine that would justify Russian action. And that secondly, even if there were something happening, that the Genocide Convention is not an excuse or does not give Russia permission to launch an invasion like this, even in response to alleged atrocities. So that case is playing out right now in The Hague.
And what would Russia actually have to do to prove it was justified? Presumably it would have to prove genocide.
Yes, that's right. It would have to demonstrate that there was genocide taking place. That's step one. But the even trickier international legal argument is that the Genocide Convention therefore authorizes them under international law to actually unilaterally take military action to stop it. And I think that's a legal question that the court would grapple with, even if Russia could prove a genocide is taking place, which of course there's no evidence of.
And what are the terms of the international treaty exactly?
So the Genocide Convention, of course, as agreed upon by nearly every country in the world, condemns and requires countries not to commit genocide against any racial, religious, ethnic group. And it does require countries to take action where they see genocide occurring. So there is an obligation under the Genocide Convention to take steps to address an ongoing genocide. The question is what those steps under international law should look like and whether military action in response to it would still require authorization by the United Nations, which is normally under our international legal system what we would expect, that the Security Council would have to authorize the use of force unless it was invited by a country itself.
Now, as I understand it, there are some 30 or so countries which will intervene with statements on behalf of Ukraine. The UK is among them. What powers does the International Court of Justice actually have in this case?
That's right. There's been an almost unprecedented number of countries coming in to weigh in on this particular case, and all on the side of Ukraine. And this is nevertheless going to be a slow process. I think that we are at the early stages of this case. The court is first making a determination about whether the case can move forward, and then they will move to the merits of the case. So we are talking about a multi-year process before we get any kind of judgment from the ICJ. They did issue a preliminary ruling last year, shortly after the case was filed by Ukraine, calling on Russia to cease its invasion, to stop the war as a preliminary measure. Of course, Russia ignored that finding. But that, the ICJ will have the power to find under international law that the Russian invasion was not justified. It can call for action by member states against Russia as a consequence. But of course, the ICJ itself does not have an enforcement mechanism.
And yet there will be no criminal convictions.
So the ICJ is not a court that targets individuals. So there will be no criminal convictions at the ICJ. There is, of course, in parallel, an investigation and now prosecutions going on at the International Criminal Court that does target individual senior Russians who are accountable for some of the war crimes and alleged crimes against humanity taking place in Ukraine.
Now, if Russia is found to have contravened the Genocide Convention, how powerful is that, and what might be the practical effect of that?
Well, there's a few things. I think one, it will dispel any kind of remaining myth or argument that the Russian invasion was justified on some kind of humanitarian or human rights grounds. I don't think, frankly, there are many countries that are leaning into that justification, but it does take away that facade or that excuse that Russia has perpetrated that they were somehow justified in that invasion. It also sets a precedent for other countries who might be thinking about using the Genocide Convention or other international statutes as an excuse to launch an invasion, to really lay down the red lines to say, here's how this convention can and cannot be used to justify military action.
Could one of the consequences, though, be also that countries that have sat on the fence over declaring allegiance one way or the other, it might bolster their decisions, decide them not to support Russia, and also perhaps encourage sanctions to be strengthened against Russia?
I think it certainly lays a clear line in the sand that there is no legal justification for this. And so countries that are sitting back and sort of debating that the legality of the invasion could be convinced by those arguments. Although I think it's worth noting that an ultimate ICC judgment is years away and could in fact come after this conflict is already over. But I think the reality is most countries that have been reluctant to take concrete action against Russia for the invasion are doing so for geopolitical or economic reasons. And so I don't know how much a judgment from the ICJ is really going to turn their reluctance into action.
And of course, any decision in this case would ultimately go to the UN Security Council, which would be vetoed by Russia. President Zelensky has questioned Russia's position at the UN. How easily could it be removed?
I don't foresee a scenario where Russia is removed from the Security Council. The way the UN Charter is written, and obviously the ability of Russia itself to veto such a resolution, the difficulty in amending the UN Charter to remove Russia is a very, very high bar. There are obviously discussions going on about how to reform the Security Council. The U.S. has come out very strongly in favor of expanding the council and shaking up how decisions are made there. And we heard that again in President Biden's speech this week. But I think that there's a big difference between trying to add countries and reshape the voting system and actually trying to remove one of the P5 members. So while I certainly think Russia has abused its position on the Security Council and its actions are not justified, I think removing them from the Security Council is probably a very difficult goal to achieve.
If we could turn our attention to the situation in Ukraine now, as an observer, what has stood out to you from the traumatic stream of evidence of suffering that we've witnessed?
Yeah, it's really remarkable, as you said, the scale and the scope of the abuses that have been perpetrated by Russia during this conflict. Their widespread and systematic nature, and I use those words intentionally because it suggests that crimes against humanity are being committed, and the fact that we see crimes being committed in every aspect of Russia's war. So early on in the air war, we saw very intentional targeting of civilian infrastructure. We continue to see that to this day. But also on the ground, we see horrific abuses of civilians, executions, torture, rape, and we see them in so many locations and so many circumstances that it's hard to see anything but a pattern, a systematic pattern and practice by the Russian military.
Can you just explain to us in what ways international law can actually apply to the kind of horrors you describe there?
Absolutely. So this is these war crimes and crimes against humanity that are being committed can actually be prosecuted in a number of different jurisdictions. Ukraine is unusual in the sense that one, they have both the willingness and the ability to actually prosecute these crimes themselves. Even in the midst of conflict, the Ukrainian government has made very clear that its justice system is up and running, it's functional, and it is capable of prosecuting war crimes, and they're doing so. So they've already convicted a number of Russian soldiers. They've brought more than 60 cases against individuals, and they've cataloged tens of thousands of war crimes that they would like to prosecute. So there's a local level of justice that will be taking place. There's also regional activity. So a number of countries in Europe and even as far away as Canada have extraterritorial jurisdiction statutes that let them prosecute war crimes that take place overseas. And so there is an effort underway by countries in the region to coordinate their own investigations, their own research and information collection to find out if they have any grounds to prosecute some of these cases in their courts. And then, of course, finally, we have the International Criminal Court, which will focus on the most senior and most serious of crimes.
And as I understand it, there are three sort of branches, if you like, of law, international law that can be applied: war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide.
That's right. Those are the three crimes that are currently being investigated by the ICC. They have jurisdiction over them because Ukraine granted them jurisdiction back in 2015 after the Russian invasion of Crimea. So even though neither Ukraine nor Russia are members of the ICC does have jurisdiction to prosecute those three crimes. There is actually a fourth crime in the ICC statute, the crime of aggression. At the time that Ukraine granted jurisdiction back in 2015, the members had not agreed on a definition of aggression. So that crime was not able to be prosecuted. As a result, there really isn't a venue internationally right now for that crime to be investigated and prosecuted. And that's the reason that Ukraine is pushing for a special international tribunal to focus specifically on that international crime.
We've spoken to the filmmaker on Frontline, John Sweeney. He gathered evidence of human rights abuses and potential war crimes in Ukraine, things like from civilians being seemingly deliberately targeted, hospitals, etc., civilian buildings, people where there's no military activity, where they've been able to show evidence, or from talking to people on the ground, there was no military activity, to the illegal use of chemicals like white phosphorus, to torture and execution of prisoners. How coordinated is the evidence that's being gathered on the ground? Do you have an idea of that?
It's a great question because, as I just referenced, with so many potential venues for prosecution, you have the potential to really crowd the investigative space. And the last thing that you want is for victims to have to tell their story over and over again to one investigator after another. You don't want multiple teams coming through trying to collect physical evidence. And so that coordination is really, really important. I think it has happened. Both the regional countries and the ICC early on agreed to work together with Ukraine to try and streamline some of that investigation. The ICC, which already had a large team on the ground, more or less full time over the last year, now has opened an office in Ukraine. It's their largest presence outside of The Hague. So they've got folks on the ground full time who can help coordinate that evidence collection. In addition, I would say, to the physical evidence and the witness interviews, which are incredibly important, there's also a huge amount of digital evidence. And so that's something that those international investigators are also coordinating on, trying to sift through and understand what it demonstrates.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I was going to ask you about the part that's being played by technology and also open source information in this war. Is it actually is it speeding up the process? Are we having real-time reporting of crimes?
Absolutely. I think what we've seen from the beginning of this war is just an unprecedented amount of information about what's happening on the ground in terms of war crimes. Everything from satellite imagery, drone footage, individual cell phone footage, social media postings. The volume of information is enormous, and there are efforts underway to collect it in databases and be able to sort through it, sift through it, and understand what's there. But the challenge in accountability for war crimes in Ukraine is not going to be a lack of evidence. There's more than enough evidence. The challenge is going to be securing defendants to actually sit in court and be prosecuted.
And just to go back to the evidence that was gathered by the filmmaker John Sweeney, he also suggested that in one Russian occupied area, Russian police were responsible for torture, pointing to a systemic state sanctioned nature of those who are being abused. Who gets prosecuted?
Absolutely. So, in a situation where crimes are directed by or part of a systematic policy of a government, both the perpetrator, the individual perpetrator of those crimes, and their superiors are subject to prosecution. And that can go all the way to the top. So, if prosecutors can demonstrate that senior cabinet officials, military leaders, or Putin himself directed or put in place policies that encompass or direct soldiers to commit war crimes, then they themselves can be held personally accountable.
So that defence that I was just following the orders just absolutely doesn't stand when it comes to criminal prosecution.
No, absolutely not.
There is an arrest warrant out for President Putin for war crimes and crimes against humanity. To return to the place where we started, do you think the day will come that he himself will be tried at The Hague for genocide?
It's hard to see that day coming anytime soon. The ICC in issuing an arrest warrant for Putin is playing a long game. It is trying to lay down a marker that responsibility for this conflict and for these crimes goes all the way to the top. And that's really important. But it's obviously going to take the right array of circumstances for Putin himself to find to be prosecuted in The Hague. It's going to take a radical change of policy or government in Russia, or it's going to take him traveling to a place that is a country that's willing to arrest him. And both those scenarios at the moment are extremely.
We've seen throughout this war and in general direction of a clamping down on human rights within Russia itself. What have you seen, and what are the chances of those kind of abuses being prosecuted?
Absolutely. So Putin has used the war with Ukraine as an excuse to crack down on political opposition, civil society, human rights defenders, and the media in Russia. And so we've seen a pretty significant deterioration of human rights inside Russia over the last year and a half as well. Something like 20,000 peaceful protesters have been arrested for opposing the war. 600 people have been prosecuted for anti-war activity, and so he's using sort of national security grounds to really clamp down on civic space. The UN Human Rights Council appointed a special rapporteur for Russia human rights for the first time last year. The first time a P5 member of the Security Council has had such a special rapporteur investigate. She issued her first report just in the last few days, and she found, again, widespread egregious abuses of human rights, torture of detainees, rape and other sexual abuse, and obviously lack of fair prosecution of those cases as well.
And what are the chances of fair prosecution of those cases going forward in the future?
Yeah, I mean, look, people subject to arbitrary arrest and detention in Russia are not going to get a fair trial. They're not going to get justice. We've seen Putin crack down on the media. We've seen just recently Nobel Peace Prize winner Dmitry Muratov, become designated as a foreign agent. So he's really using this moment to crack down on what's happening in his own country to maintain his power. There's no international criminal jurisdiction for what's happening there. Russia certainly won't authorize the ICC to do any kind of investigation. So justice for the abuses that Russia is committing against its own citizens is going to take some time. It's going to take a change of government inside Russia.
When you look at the situation since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, in fact, even before that, with the annexation of Crimea, what have you noticed in terms of human rights and the crimes that have been committed? Is there anything that's actually stood out to you that's different from what you've witnessed in your career before?
I think what's different is what we were referencing before, just how widespread and systematic these crimes are, how little effort there's been to hide them. Obviously, because of what we were talking about, the technology available, people recording footage on their cell phones, it's hard to hide what's happening on the ground. But the targeting of civilian infrastructure in an air campaign, these efforts to specifically destroy power infrastructure, water infrastructure that primarily harms civilians. The Russians are not hiding the ball in terms of their approach to this war, and I think that's what stands out a little bit from other conflicts where you try and see countries sort of justify their actions or try and hide or disguise their war crimes. Here we have, as I said, just an abundance of evidence that these are taking place on a widespread scale and that they are authorized or directed from the top.
And how do you assess the targeting of Russia, inside Russia, by drones, which is being attributed to Ukraine?
It's a very interesting development. I think obviously in terms of conflict, there are legitimate military targets inside Russia for Ukraine. Obviously, Ukraine is subject to the same international laws as Russia and everyone else, and so what we don't want to see is them targeting civilians or civilian infrastructure in a way that is, disproportionate to their military objectives in doing so. So ultimately, they're subject to the same rules as everybody else.
Do you think there might be any prosecution in that light against Ukraine in the future?
We have to closely watch their actual behavior. There were allegations early on of Ukrainian abuse of Russian POWs, for example, and that's something that I think the Ukrainians tried to address very quickly to avoid that being, seen as a policy or systematic practice that would rise to the level of a war crime as opposed to an individual crime. I'm not sure we've seen that yet in the drone attacks, but certainly something they should be conscious of.
Marti Flacks, it's been great talking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. My thanks to Louis Sykes, our producer. To support the work of Frontline, hit the subscribe button. You can also listen to Times Radio throughout the day or read it at times.co.uk. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.